Redfall sees Arkane experiment with melding genres to mixed results. There's plenty of flashes of this style and narrative flair we've come to expect from this incredible studio as you explore the town and face off with its undead inhabitants. However, the mixing of FPS action and story beats with open world exploration and a relatively relaxed pace leads to a balancing act that may leave hardcore shooter fans and Arkane superfans alike wanting for more. If you come to it looking for a chilled out bit of vampire hunting, there's still plenty to enjoy here. But some irksome AI issues and a lack of clarity over what it really wants to be leave it feeling a little lost in a limbo of its own making. Ahoy folks, Craig signing in for Pure Xbox, and I'll be damned, Redfall is finally here. Now, our review was written by the talented PJ O'Reilly and whipped into video format by me. So, let's sink our teeth into it. After multiple delays and the somewhat controversial decision to launch on current-gen consoles at a locked 30 FPS, Arkane Studios has finally managed to get Redfall out the door and into the hands of its players. This is a game that we have been digging the style of from what we've seen of the pre-release footage, with its Stranger Things, suburban gothic vibes, and the same unique look to characters and landscapes that runs throughout all of Arkane's previous releases. But now that we've spent a bunch of time blasting through its campaign, how does it actually play? Well, as an experiment in melding genre types together, Redfall is certainly a bit of a mixed bag. Arkane is renowned for its exquisite world building, for its ability to flesh out characters and scenarios through environmental storytelling, and the endless lore scattered throughout its carefully crafted worlds. Now that stuff is here, present, and correct, if not slightly watered down from what you'd find in the studio's strictly single-player fare. Of course, it's obvious and expected that a balance needed to be struck to successfully introduce the co-op looter-shooter side of proceedings, the side of proceedings that we would wager most players here are excited to dive into with this one. And so the game finds itself in a balancing act which isn't always successful, especially as it tries to give you the world building, story beats, and fleshed out characterizations, whilst also ensuring that there's no major downtime or slowing of the pace as up to 4 players dive into combat against an array of vampiric and human foes. It's in the first half of the campaign's roughly 20-hour running time that the struggle to maintain this balance is most keenly felt. That's especially true if you're playing solo, where the opening hours can feel strangely quiet and rather unchallenging as you deal with small groups of enemies and a smattering of mini-bosses in between ransacking locations and exploring the open world for loot and scraps of lore. It was in these opening hours that we were least convinced that what Arkane was attempting had actually panned out. However, stick with it. Beat the game's first proper boss and graduate to the second area in the game. Yep, there is more than one world map, and it's here that things pick up considerably, with tougher enemy types, larger groups of foes, and more in a way of a challenge to give you and your pals a workout. But let's rewind a little bit. At launch, Redfall gives you a roster of 4 heroes to tool around with, each one roughly adhering to a cooperative shooter stereotype. You've got Jacob and his Raven, who can mark out enemies, cloak the entire squad in camouflage, and take to the roof to ping enemies from range with his ghostly sniper rifle. Defender brings the technical gizmos with a teleportation device, lightning javelins that react with water to create obstacles for your foes, and a UV blacklight ult that petrifies vamps for easy takedowns. You've also got Layla, who can call on her vampire ex-boyfriend for assistance when her ultra gauge is filled, and a handy telekinetic umbrella that acts as a shield. Layla can also summon psychic lifts that the entire team can use to traverse environments. And finally, we've got Remy, the support build who's able to draw the attention of enemies, throw down C4 charges, and create a healing space for the group to rally at as they battle. All in all, they're a fairly standard bunch, providing plenty of fun banter with no real surprises in terms of their abilities, but Redfall's main focus isn't really on exacting teamwork anyway. Sure, you can mix things up by combining powers in some fun ways, use Layla's lift to boost Jacob to a sniping point, or use his camo to hide the entire squad. But honestly, the co-op here feels like it's mostly for the vibes, for the banter, and for the camaraderie of just experiencing its open world and story with friends in tow. Indeed, playing with a couple of friends sees you earn trust between the characters, which in turn opens further dialogue and gives you more backstory into each of the available heroes. And there's no limitation on having multiples of any hero in a party, giving the fusing of powers a further push into the background.
Bam!
With regards to weapons, there's a decent enough array of pistols, shotguns, assault and sniper rifles, and these are all joined by UV guns and stake launchers that make for fun ways to dispatch your undead foes. As per usual, guns come in various rarities, from common to legendary, and the most powerful pistols and rifles can straight up kill a vamp, saving you from the need to down them before driving a stake through their heart. Although we do still prefer this method when we've got time for it. This pool of weapons is the same for every character, with no restrictions on who can use what. Again, feeding into that laid-back vibe that focused much more on the fun of rampaging and exploring together rather than who's got what gun, exact positioning, or timed recharging and deployment of skills. Just forget all that. You've also got a nice big skill tree to unlock for each character, with boosts for reviving teammates, longer lasting skills, quicker cooldowns, and all the sort of stuff that you'll be well used to from other shooters by now. You can also equip various trinkets in the form of blood and vampire god remnants that give you different perks and boosts. There's nothing surprising in any of this, and honestly, it's in the loot, and particularly the guns that you'll find scattered around environments and after big boss battles, that we were most dissatisfied with Redfall. They're not a bad mix of weapon types, punchy enough to use and satisfying in the heat of the moment. It's just that, all in all, it's a bit pedestrian. And there's nothing you'll find, certainly at least in your first run through of the game, that stands out as a really special gun that's worth the hassle. This is a looter shooter that shifts away from the careful micromanagement and weapon fetishization you'll find in Destiny or The Division to a more laid-back approach. It also sits well away from the full-on horde rampages of the likes of Left 4 Dead. You've got space to breathe, to explore, and to take in the many delightful sights of the surprisingly weird and warped world that feels very much like a mix of Deathloop's Black Reef, Dishonored's Dunwall, and Prey's Talos 1 blitzed with Buffy and Stranger Things. If that all sounds like a tasty combination to you, then you're likely to have a good enough time. In terms of enemies and activities, Redfall again doesn't really fit the mold of previous looter shooters, as it attempts to meld its storytelling and exploration with action. You get a decent variety of vampires to battle, with shrouds who plunge the world into darkness as you fight them, anglers who can reel you into their arms for huge damage, exploding blood bags, plenty of vampire god mini-bosses, and a handful of showpiece bosses who make up the main villains that drive the narrative forward. However, these foes are thrown at you in a relatively restrained way. You won't be constantly overrun, you can choose to sneak around fights or get busy causing chaos with the many environmental tricks and traps, gasoline slicks, exploding canisters, pools of water, and the like. There are also multiple human enemies, with several cultist groups and the security forces of Bellwether to take on, and it's nice to see these various groups fighting each other in dynamic battles as you skulk around and maneuver to your next objective. Besides main missions that see you work to piece together the motives of the game's main vampire villains before taking them on in battle, you'll also indulge in fairly bog-standard side missions that see you retrieve items, destroy enemy encampments, and you get the gist. You'll need to scour the entire map to find and unlock safe rooms and historical monuments that act as fast travel points too. And the safe rooms come with their own missions to keep you busy. More interesting than the vanilla side missions are vampire nests, which see you enter twisted psychic spaces where you'll need to venture forward and destroy a central heart before nabbing a bunch of loot and escaping before the nest collapses. It's in these activities that Redfall feels most confident, where it gets trippy and lets the atmosphere and artistry of the world overtake the action. And herein lies the game's biggest issue. It tells a decent tale, it's got decent action, and it'll provide you and your pals with a decent time as you jump in to discover its many secrets, collect all of its trinkets, discover the lore, and defeat its vampire lords. However, infusing its FPS shooter action with slow-paced exploration and storytelling, both sides of the equation kinda lose out. Redfall isn't laser focused on any one thing, and so its narrative falls short on the likes of Deathloop or Prey. Its shooting and powers, tricks and traps can't match those found in Dishonored, and you're left with a game that sits in a space that's really most successful when you approach it as intended, in an almost chilled out manner. Take in the sights, revel in the atmosphere, take the time to play the story in solo first, so you can drink in the details before introducing friends to the mix, and there's a decent time to be had. However, hardcore strategic-minded shooter fans will be left wanting, as too will solo players who are mentally prepared for Arkane's usual narrative mystery. Of course, we can't end this review without some sort of discussion with regards to the controversial decision to deploy the game without a 60 FPS performance mode, and well, in the end, we didn't find the locked 30 FPS experience to be a huge problem. The action feels slick and punchy for the most part, certainly not held back in any huge way by its frame rate, and although we'd have preferred to play it in 60 FPS, this will do nicely until that patch arrives. Now, this isn't gonna appease the 60 FPS diehards, we realize that. But if you can make peace with it, the quality mode does a reasonably solid job for now. We say reasonably because there are a handful of occasions where 30 FPS does struggle a little. These issues didn't arise often for us, but in a few of the bigger encounters, the stuttering did become noticeable. We also had other technical issues, with characters running on a spot when we were stood still, and at one point we even had to reload our game as our crouch button decided to just straight up stop working. So there are rough edges and bugs that I'm sure will be ironed out somewhere down the line. More egregious than any of this stuff, however, are weaknesses with the game's AI.
Okay, count of 3, I want you to come out where I can see you, okay? Okay, 1, 2, 3.
You'll spot human enemies getting caught up in this loop of trying to find cover, which sees them running around with their back to you rather than actually fighting. And they sometimes take far too long to notice your presence. For a game that starts out by detailing how you'll need to use stealth carefully through environments, this stuff is kind of disappointing. Overall, the AI does a decent job in battles, it's serviceable, but there's no shortage of incidents of confusion, non-interaction, and moments that see multiple foes lost in scenery or unable to keep up with your use of camo tactics or simple flanking maneuvers. Vampires fare much better, but there's work to be done in this regard. These issues aside though, and if you're coming at it looking for a stylish, uniquely chilled bit of vampire slaying with pals, we'd reckon Redfall just about succeeds more than it fails. It's certainly not a fully successful experiment by any means, but it's a fun enough one. One we've enjoyed playing through solo and in brief excursions of co-op. We look forward to jumping into it all over again with a few pals for a nice chat and a bit of vampire hunting in the unlockable hardest difficulty over the coming weeks. And with more characters and content due to be added down the line, this feels like a solid base for Arkane to add to and work from in the future.
Too close.
So let us know what you think of our review in the comments below, and also be sure to share if you're going to be jumping on this day one or perhaps waiting for that 60 FPS performance mode patch. For all things Xbox, be sure to subscribe to the channel and go to www.purexbox.com for the latest news, reviews, and previews. That's all for now. Craig signing off.